After Bob Mueller's indictments were released, we learned that Bernie Sanders and Jill Stein were also the beneficiaries of so-called Russian election meddling. Now, I have a problem referring to it as election meddling because I don't necessarily believe that shitposting and posting memes is actually going to have any sway on the election whatsoever. But since Russian trolls made social media posts that were beneficial to Jill Stein and Bernie Sanders, well, members of the hashtag resistance wasted no time punching left and smearing these progressives as potential Russian puppets. Now, since you can't really compete with people like Bernie Sanders and Jill Stein on the policy substance, since they're pushing for policies that are overwhelmingly popular, well, the way that you can discredit them effectively is by using McCarthyism as a tool. And I told you about how Bernie Sanders was being smeared by the hashtag resistance as a Russian puppet, but the resistance also has Jill Stein back in their sights, and they're now smearing her as a Russian puppet again. So for example, MSNBC contributor and self-proclaimed leader of the resistance, Scott Dworkin, tweeted this out about Jill Stein. Here's Jill Stein trashing the US while in Russia in December of 2015. She attended a Russian propaganda TV gala and sat at the table with Mike Flynn and Putin. Keep in mind, there was absolutely no reason for her to be there except to become a Russian pawn. So understand that he's actually taking this McCarthyism a step further, because up until this point, a lot of neoliberals just implied that she was maybe an unwitting agent of the Russian government, but he's explicitly saying that she was a knowing pawn of the Russian government. Now, she asserts that she attended this gala that was hosted to celebrate RT, and since American hosts like Lee Camp support Jill Stein and the Green Party tends to get more coverage on RT than other mainstream media networks, Jill Stein was invited to this gala. Now, when Scott Dworkin calls RT Russian propaganda, I'm inclined to believe him because he knows what he's talking about when it comes to propaganda, since he's on the payroll of MSNBC, a network that also does propaganda, but instead at the behest of multinational corporations and the Democratic Party's billionaire donors. So I don't know which is worst, honestly. Actually, I do. I'll take objective progressive hosts like Lee Camp, Tom Hartman, and Ed Schultz over neoliberal hacks like Scott Dworkin and Joyanne Reid and Rachel Maddow any day of the week, because we get better reporting from a so-called Russian propaganda network. We get more attention to issues that really affect us, like Dakota Access Pipeline, climate change, on RT than we do on MSNBC. So certainly to call them propaganda, he needs to look in the mirror because he's working for a propaganda network. However, if you thought that they were just restricting their smears of Jill Stein to social media, again, they didn't. So MSNBC actually decided to bring Jill Stein on to suggest again that she was a Russian puppet, and she defended herself in a way that I think was really powerful, because you could see the passion in her eyes. She's just done. She's done with the bullshit. She's done with people saying that our votes don't belong to us. They belong to the Democratic Party. Take a look.
That indictment came out and your name was mentioned in there. I do want to play a soundbite that you may have heard earlier. It was from our blast block. It's John Podesta, of course, from the Clinton campaign. And here's what he said today. Take a listen to this.
They were pushing votes, just to give one example, to Jill Stein. Her vote in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin was greater than the gap. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in those states. So you can't prove that it did affect the outcome, but it certainly seems likely that it had some impact.
So, while we may never know precisely whether these efforts played a role in the outcome of the election, when we look at 3 of the states that Russia targeted, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania being among those that they targeted, Pennsylvania as well, if I didn't say that, is it plausible that these Russian actors created enough influence that changed a few thousand votes here and there, and ultimately that could have altered the election?
So let me say the assumption here is that the votes belong to Hillary Clinton and that that my votes were stolen from someone else. And I think that's an insult to American voters who really deserve to choose, who made it perfectly clear that they did not like. In fact, these were the most distrusted and disliked candidates in recorded history. So to try to excuse my votes as being stolen from Hillary is outrageous. But beyond that, we have data. We actually have scientific data on how people voted. And what we know is that the people who voted for me in vast majority, over 60%, would not have voted if I wasn't there. And of the remainder who would vote, many of them would have gone to Donald Trump. So just asserting that those votes belong to Hillary is just another sign of the arrogance of the Democratic establishment, which is really working overtime here to silence its opposition. And if you look at the smear campaign that's actually been conducted against me about being a Russian tool, when did that get started? Remember, my trip based on foreign policy, on a peace offensive, on addressing nuclear weapons and the climate crisis.
You were speaking against the war, yep, while you were there.
Absolutely, and trying to promote nuclear disarmament and really substantive climate emergency action, talking not only to Russian media and officials. On that same trip, I spoke to the deputy lead negotiator for China at the climate talks. I spoke with Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the Labour Party in the UK. So these are really critical issues. And I'd say what's wrong with our elected officials that this is not on their agenda. Issue.
Now, before we even talk about that segment, look at the banner that they displayed on that screen. 2016 Green Party candidate named as tool of Russia to damage Clinton. So she's now a tool of Russia. It's not that Russian trolls, generally speaking, were trying to stir shit up. Now, they're suggesting explicitly so that Jill Stein was a witting agent of Russian election meddling. Gary Johnson took more votes away from Donald Trump if you accept that third-party candidates take votes away from the establishment candidates. But still, with that in mind, Donald Trump rarely complained as much about Gary Johnson as neoliberal Democrats complained about Jill Stein. And let's not forget that Jill Stein literally led the charge to get recounts in crucial swing states, and even Hillary Clinton's team got on board with that because it would disproportionately benefit Hillary Clinton. I don't think that a Russian tool would do something like that. Democrats who previously voted for Obama in the Rust Belt flipped and voted for Donald Trump. But instead, the finger gets pointed at Jill Stein and her voters because even though they still voted for the liberal candidate and didn't vote for Trump, third-party voters are supposedly more problematic than the literal Democrats who flipped and voted for Trump and betrayed their own party. And let's not forget that Hillary won the popular vote but lost in key swing states she never visited. And this obviously demonstrates not that Russian election meddling ultimately swayed the election, but instead shows us that Hillary Clinton ran a terrible campaign. That's obvious. And the worst part about vote shaming and the continued vote shaming we see from neoliberal Democrats is that it's insulting. It's insulting to our intelligence. They're basically saying that we're dumb. We can't think for ourselves. If we didn't support Queen Hillary, then we must be dumb. It can't possibly because we came to that decision on our own accord. It's because we're dumb and we were duped by Russia. Well, again, I've shared this on the show before. This is the specific moment when I realized I could never vote for Hillary Clinton. It was this right here that did it for me.
Health emergencies can't wait for us to have some theoretical debate about some better idea that will never, ever come to pass.
Did Russia make Hillary Clinton say that? Because that's the only way you can argue that Russia influenced my vote, is if somehow Russia was able to get Hillary Clinton to say that. I couldn't vote for a candidate personally that wasn't even willing to fight for Medicare for All because I actually have standards. And guess what? Now more and more Democrats are realizing that Medicare for All is a litmus test and they're getting on board with Medicare for All. This wouldn't have happened if Hillary Clinton won. Now, that's not to imply that Donald Trump is preferable to Hillary Clinton because I think most liberals, myself included, can easily see how Hillary Clinton was still the lesser of two evils, even though she was still very evil. But the problem is that each election cycle, the lesser evil keeps getting more and more evil. So the greater evil 10 years ago is now on par with the lesser evil now. And I wanted to break away from that cycle and vote my conscience once and for all. And since I was in a solid blue state, I decided to vote for Jill Stein, knowing I would have had to rethink my decision if I lived in a swing state. But fuck me, right? Fuck anyone that dared to take a stand against an increasingly conservative party that's supposed to be a left-wing party. You see, this is what happens. This is a really inconvenient truth that the Democratic Party doesn't want to acknowledge. If you continue to get out of touch with voters, they leave you. They don't stay. Those votes aren't guaranteed. You're not owed votes by liberals just because you are less conservative than the Republican Party. You still have to do things that your base wants you to do. And since the Democratic Party is getting more and more out of touch, that's why they're losing more, hence why they've lost more than 1,000 seats in legislatures across the country. So to suggest that Jill Stein, third-party voters, Susan Sarandon, anyone who didn't fall in line and vote for Hillary Clinton is responsible for Donald Trump, that's just egregious, and you should be ashamed of yourself for vote shaming. Now, if you're going to vote shame anyone, theoretically speaking, you would want to target the people who actually did flip the election. Rust Belt voters who previously voted for Obama that flipped and voted for Donald Trump. But instead, they target Jill Stein voters, people who didn't vote for Donald Trump. It's because the idea is to shame people who don't fall in line and vote for the establishment. Well, we're done with that. I'm going to vote my conscience, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you want to make sure that you get my vote next time, Democrats, then do better.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.